So then why do we pay interest to private shareholders for that money supply, even as its value gets weaker by the passing day? Do bankers and Washington policymakers really think you and your community are that stupid? Well, are you?
There's a good old-fashioned word for people like us. We call them suckers. And there are other people who stay up nights figuring out how to take away what they've got.
As you see, the top hat is still worn, but today only by a few.
We are at a historic turning point.
Money as debt is a form of slavery. It's changed everything.
Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank.
I don't hang around trying to read the entrails of what some statement in the administration may say, because it's our responsibility to make up our mind about these things.
There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily hiding hundreds of miles south.
The key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control, and also we will have the technology to enforce that.
It's a secret meeting at the time. They told nobody about it. The details came out later, but this is the place where the most important people in the world first came up with a formal plan to create the Federal Reserve.
This place is crazy.
I have alleged that there is a money trust.
Better for the state relative to cash.
Hi, welcome to Jekyll Island. To begin, first make a selection at the top. Second, please insert cash on the left or credit card on the right.
D, all of the above. It's not. 7 years since.
Between 92 and 93, outgoing President Bush and incoming President Clinton both worked towards the fulfillment of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which the latter signed into law.
Everybody knows there will be some winners, but and some losers.
And you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
On January 1st, 1993, after years of agreements dating in principle back to 1957, the European single market is officially launched. Monetary union would mean that Europe had a single currency, its supply controlled by a European central bank. Internal exchange rates would be fixed. On January 1st, 1995, the World Trade Organization took effect, replacing the World War II-era GATT. The WTO now represents 96% of global trade. This age, closely identified with Clinton, is the era of globalization, a world economy, for better or for worse. Career Goldman Sachs man Robert Rubin ascended to chairman by 1990, became President Clinton's leading advisor on economic policy, and head of the National Economic Council by 1993, then Treasury Secretary by 1995, and he was considered the chief architect of the Deficit Reduction Act of 1993, and took credit for the first balanced budget in 3 decades. By 95, Rubin as Treasury Secretary began, with the financial lobby in tow, to push for a legislative regulatory overhaul, tearing down the separations between commercial and investment banking that had been in place since the 1930s-era Glass-Steagall Act. The Depression-era law was designed to prevent banks from ruinous speculation in financial markets with depositor funds. Rubin stated, quote, "We believe the private sector should be able to decide itself how to structure its own business." Backing Rubin, Fed Chair Alan Greenspan endorsed the bill, stating it was the next logical step in the ongoing evolution of the financial system.
The stakes in getting this right are clearly enormous. The Bureau of Economic Analysis estimated that in 1995, Americans spent roughly $300 billion on financial services. That is to say, on brokerage, insurance, and banking services. Even if increased competition were to lead to a saving of just 1%, that's $3 billion.
But nobody really speculated on who would pick up the pieces should they fall.
Other proponents of NAFTA told us what a wonderful trade package NAFTA would be. Year has come and gone, and some 50,000 American workers are now applied for NAFTA benefits as a result of losing their jobs. Over a year ago, we were told that NAFTA would significantly increase our export capability to Mexico, that the Mexicans were just lining up ready to buy our products. And yet the trade surplus that we used to have with Mexico has significantly shrunk over the years, over the last year. During the last 2 months, we have in fact run almost unprecedentedly a trade deficit with Mexico, as I understand it, in November, a $378 million trade deficit with Mexico. We're importing now more than we are exporting. Over a year ago, we were told that NAFTA would improve the Mexican economy. It was good for Mexico. During the last month, we've had a 40% devaluation of the Mexican peso. The real wages of Mexican workers is in rapid decline. A very poor country is now suffering significantly increased poverty. And now you're back again. And now all we have to do is put at risk $40 billion of American taxpayers' money. Now, it seems to me, and I don't claim to be a great economist, but given the fact that our middle class is shrinking, the real wages of American workers are in decline, we have 5 million children who are hungry, we have a growing gap between the rich and the poor, given the fact that the United States Congress is doing a pretty bad job running the economy of the United States, I would be somewhat surprised if we were capable of running the economy of Mexico. And we might want to let the Mexican people run their own economy as best they can.
Treasury Secretary Rubin's push for deregulation seemed more than incredibly ironic, considering it came the same year after Barings, the investment banking firm which helped finance both the British and American empires, the epitome of the old-school City of London banker in the top hat and tails, collapsed once and for all after 232 years. Some people might see that with symbolic significance. Barings became insolvent as a result of a series of increasingly bad, scratch and make that astonishingly bad trades, to compensate for a string of increasing losses and gambling on speculative markets. This supposedly occurred primarily at the hands of one 28-year-old Barings employee named Nick Leeson. Leeson had been attempting to dig out of a hole and cover up his losses with sketch-ass futures contracts, a form of derivatives. The key bulk of these futures were placed on the Singapore Exchange, which tanked spectacularly after the January 17, 1995 Kobe earthquake in Japan, which in turn left Leeson completely unable to meet his cash requirements and left the entire bank insolvent. He wrote a note that literally said, "I'm sorry," then attempted to abscond back to London, though he was intercepted and arrested when his plane touched down in continental Europe. His losses totaled nearly, but not quite, £1 billion. This event highlighted the problem of out-of-control derivatives markets. And so despite the fact that the Barings Bank fiasco should have sounded a major cautionary note to everybody, Congress, financial regulators, pretty much anyone with any reason to pay attention to economic affairs at all, you have Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin lobbying to revise Glass-Steagall.
Banks due to usury practices.
I especially am outraged by the prospect of a $40 billion bailout and the loss of taxpayers' money at the same time as congressional leaders are talking about cutbacks in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the terrible $200 billion deficit we currently have. Small businesses that are folding, they don't have any loan guarantees. Why should working people in America guarantee those benefits, those investments in Mexico? You used to work for Goldman and Sachs, correct? So you have some familiarity with this process. Now, why don't you go back to your patriotic friends on Wall Street and say, hey, we got a problem. So why are you asking the average American to bail out and guarantee those investments? Rubin?
Mr. Sanders, I truly don't think that this has anything to do with bailing out those investors. And I'll speak for myself. I couldn't care less about bailing out those investors. And if those investors lost every nickel of their investment, I, for one, couldn't care one whit. What I do care about is what the president has spoken so much about, and I think he's right in his observation, that if you look forward 5, 10, 15 years into the future, the great opportunity for this country is to be part of the global economy, the developing countries, and Mexico is
You're not answering the you're not answering the question.
I'll answer.
Answer the question, please. Why should the American taxpayers guarantee investments in Mexico, which will reap a 20% rate of return?
Overlapping this period generally were a series of crises in the Scandinavian countries. Latin America, Mexico's peso crisis, which was linked to international capital facilitated by NAFTA, and later Japan, Asia, then Russia. We haven't got time to indulge in each case, as each has their own details, but they generally built upon and precipitated later crises. It notably increased global interventions by the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve in the name of preventing collapse at home due to entangled global investments. These not only involved lending tens of billions to foreign economies in crisis, but saw the trio of Rubin, Greenspan, and Larry Summers increasingly hyped as the Committee to Save the World. Though some would refuse to acknowledge it, the plunge protection team in the fully globalized era was now holding the world economy by the hand.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Library of Congress for hosting us here. At my understanding, this may be the only time in American history a piece of legislation has been signed here. It is Thomas Jefferson's building. Most of you know President Jefferson deeded his books to our young nation after our first library was burned to the ground in the War of 1812. The volumes that lined these walls grew out of Jefferson's legacy. He understood that democracy depends upon the free flow of information. He said, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine. And he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me." Today, the information revolution is spreading light, the light Jefferson spoke about all across our land and all across the world. This law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep.
The Telecommunications Act of 1996, signed on February 8th, is a milestone of the digital age, carving out a regulatory path as millions and then billions went online, making way for the internet and various innovations of communications across the broadcasting spectrum. Oh yeah, and almost limitless spying with technology. I mean, it was always true, you know that it was, so. On June 18th, 1996, cryptologists at the National Security Agency posted a paper on an MIT email thread, subsequently publishing it, entitled "How to Make a Mint: The Cryptography of Anonymous Electronic Cash." But that's probably not going to be very important, right? So we might talk about it later. Though literally no one had any idea at the time, the conditions of the late 90s were contributing to a burgeoning crisis that literally no one could possibly have foreseen.
Brooksley Born recognized that the financial security of all Americans was being put to risk by the greed, negligence, and opposition of powerful and well-connected interests. She had the guts to stick her neck out by suggesting, if you can imagine this, that maybe we should have a sensible regulatory regime for derivatives.
Oh, wait, except for Brooksley Born, head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. While practically screaming caution, Miss Bourne began in 1997 and throughout 1998 attempting to regulate the ridiculously volatile and ridiculously unregulated derivatives market, which has made somewhat of an art out of trading fiction upon fiction in just the most imaginative and yet still watching paint dry, boring, economically technical way.
Wage, price controls, and inflation. Weight and price controls and impression. The federal impression of wage and price controls.
An experienced financial litigator who'd seen the worst of the markets, Bourne was a believer in government regulation. Given the political climate in Washington at the time, clashes with Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers were inevitable. Almost right away, she had one. It began after she received an invitation to lunch at the Federal Reserve with the chairman himself.
He said something to the effect of, well, Brooksley, we're never going to agree on fraud. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you probably think there should be rules against it. She said, well, yes, I do. He said, I think the market will figure it out.
But Bourne's efforts were blocked by the resistance team, none other than Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and Fed Chair Alan Greenspan.
Well, I think she was taken aback about how far he would go towards deregulation, that even the notion that we should police fraudulent activity, he didn't think was something that was a given.
The Alan Greenspan lunch, did it actually happen? Where he says...
I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it on camera.
Greenspan refused to speak to Frontline at all.
Greenspan, who not only opposed the CFTC's attempt at regulating the derivatives market, but employed classic fear-mongering in an attempt to convince Ms. Bourne and then Congress that her regulatory actions as head of the CFTC could themselves trigger a financial crisis, or capital flight, or both.
Looking inside Wall Street's black box was impossible for Bourne, or indeed any other government regulator.
They're unregulated. The contracts aren't traded on exchanges. They're entered into between private parties.
There was no record-keeping requirement imposed on participants in the market. There was no reporting.
There's no way, really, for the government or anyone else to know how many of these are out there, know how big a market it is.
And that's what frightened Bourne more than anything. Trillions of dollars, and the biggest banks in the country operating in secret. If something went terribly wrong, the high-stakes derivatives market could take down the entire financial system.
On October 27, 1997, the Dow Jones saw its biggest one-day drop ever. Stock markets were closed in response to sell-offs in Asia and Hong Kong in particular. A decade after this 7.18% single-day crash smashed through so-called circuit breaker halts designed to prevent crashes similar to the October 87 disaster. Treasury Secretary Rubin called it a market correction. So, no big whoop. February 4th, 1998 would go down in infamy as the day that Bill Gates was hit thrice in the face with a pie.
A cowardly sneak attack on one of the world's wealthiest men. The target was Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates arriving for a meeting with community leaders. Watch what happens when a team of hitmen meet him first with a pie in the face.
Thrown by so-called Belgian anarchists while Gates was headed to a meeting.
Gates was momentarily and understandably shaken, but he was not injured. The hit squad piled on with two more pies before one of them was wrestled to the ground and arrested. The others released the moment he got away.
By August 1998, Gates began depositions in the antitrust suit against Microsoft. He was considered uncooperative, repeatedly questioned basic definitions of words, and continuously could not recall so many times that he kind of morphed into a Clinton about it.
Not recalling the specifics of the interview is that it's very unlikely I would make a statement like that without some common understanding between myself and the reporter of what that term, which out of context is incredibly ambiguous, what it meant in the context of her series of questions.
And just to be sure I understand it, what you're saying is that you don't remember what the definition was, and you don't even remember that there was a definition, but you believe there must have been a definition or you wouldn't have been using these words. Is that fair?
There must have been a common understanding. I wouldn't say a definition.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
In April 1998, Citicorp and Travelers Group agreed to a merger that would create the mega entity Citigroup.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin announced a plan to allow banks to compete in other areas of financial services, a move that could change the whole structure of the U.S. banking system.
Let's cue some Godzilla, Mechazilla footage there. An agreement that directly violated the tenets of Glass-Steagall as it crossed the streams of commercial and investment banking. This was more than just a bank. It was a mega bank, a global marketplace unto itself with tentacles reaching everywhere across the globe. Though their formation was supposedly prohibited by law, the Federal Reserve gave them a temp waiver. Temporary because, after all, the Treasury Department was already working to change the laws to allow this merger and other genetically engineered mega firms to ascend dominant in the global economy. Fascinating case since Rubin became a director with Citi right after he left his Treasury post, and just in time to preside over a derivatives heyday, and Citi's collapse and subsequent bailout. And wouldn't you just guess how much he walked away with? Meanwhile, in the fall of 1998, a hedge fund known by the extremely boring on-the-nose name of Long-Term Capital Management reached the brink of collapse, and it was centered around, once again, derivatives, the very issue that CFTC head Brooksley Born had been warning about. Long-term capital shit was all up in the fan. Like an insane taffy-pulling daredevil, they'd managed to leverage something like $5 billion into $1 trillion by swapping back and forth with basically all the biggest firms on Wall Street. Then, after they lost a ton of money in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and plenty more with the 1998 Russian financial crisis, Long-Term Capital Management got into some short-term trouble, and they acted like arrogant little bitches about it. In the end, the president's Plunge Protection Working Group on Financial Markets moved quietly to mobilize $3.6 billion from a dozen leading Wall Street firms under the supervision of the Federal Reserve, averting the crisis that even Greenspan admitted could tank the whole entire economy. In the wake of this incident, Greenspan urged Congress to pass legislation, not to regulate derivatives, mind you, because that only makes all kinds of sense in the world, but instead to prevent the Commodities Future Trading Commission from being allowed to regulate the over-the-counter derivatives industry at all, despite the fact that its head, Brooksley Born, had just been warning about this potentially cataclysmic issue and was proven right. Nevertheless, in 1999, temporary restrictions on the CFTC's power were passed in Congress, hidden down deep in an agricultural bill writer, of all things, until more permanent legislation could be passed in the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. Born resigned shortly after the temporary restriction order on regulations, which is really good, right? Since she, individually as a single person and not the wildly insane speculative derivatives market, had the potential to drop trow on the economy. And then we hit 1999, the famous party song and album by Prince released back in 1982, where we were supposed to party like that. I don't know, it's like we're on a loop or something. Also, on January 1st, 1999, the euro was officially established as a currency, and the European Central Bank assumed full powers, sending quiet thanks to members of the Bilderberg Group. In February 1999, Bill Clinton was acquitted in his impeachment trial. But suddenly everyone wanted to know what the definition of is.
is.
April 8th, 1999, Bill Gates was recognized as the new wealthiest person in the entire world, as Microsoft stocks soared. On June 1st, 1999, Napster was launched, and kids everywhere began downloading a single song they really liked over a 3 to 4 hour period on a dial-up connection. You could call it a transition. Oh yes, that's right. Also, In-Q-Tel was founded in 1999, forging an official partnership between the CIA and Silicon Valley, a not-for-profit venture capital firm designed to bankroll new tech startups and develop technologies and gadgets for the military and intelligence. Or, just mass surveillance throughout every strata of society. On November 12, 1999, after endless propagandizing and guilting the public, Robert Rubin and Greenspan's touted reform of Glass-Steagall finally became official. Via the Gramm-Leach... Is this Biley? Which tore down the walls of financial regulation and made the Federal Reserve the mega regulator of basically everything. Oh yeah, and it changed the law so Citigroup no longer needed that pesky waiver. This right here is the moment that many economists, and even some of the bill's backers, would later blame as contributing causes of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis.
Still, the decision to go global proved pivotal for Goldman Sachs, transforming it from a great American bank into a worldwide powerhouse. Goldman forged a new, less certain business, led, ironically, by the point man for U.S. economic policy today, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin. Previously, as co-chairman at Goldman, Rubin pushed the firm into risk arbitrage, using sophisticated analysis to bet the company's own assets on high-risk trades.
Bob spearheaded some of the more risky trading businesses, the proprietary trading businesses.
The man who presided over the best economy in a generation is going back to private life. The Secretary of the Treasury, Bob Rubin, who said today that he really was resigning, has been described in such glowing terms that he'd begun to sound indispensable. All sorts of people today, including the president, have called him the best Treasury Secretary since Alexander Hamilton, who was the first secretary in 1789.
Yeah. No man is indispensable, perhaps, but the team of Rubin and Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan had achieved almost a mystical reputation among economic investors.
And uncoincidentally, this moment in 1999 is also about the same time that then CEO Hank Paulson took Goldman Sachs, Wall Street's oldest investment bank, public.
Partners who owned the firm and had no obligation to shareholders, the press, or other outsiders. That freedom allowed Goldman a culture of privacy, even secrecy, that many believe was critical to its success. A culture reflected even in Goldman's discreet New York headquarters. No sign, just an address.
Meaning that future losses, if any, could be soaked up by stock investors rather than the full responsibility falling on its partners. But all the bankers and all the bankers' men said these changes were good for goose and gander, so...
That's where we're fooling ourselves.
Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz would later state in 2008, quote, "As a result, the culture of investment banks was conveyed to commercial banks, and everyone got involved in the high-risk gambling mentality. That mentality was core to the problem that we're facing now." January 1st, 2000.
A Senate panel describes Y2K, the year 2000 computer bug, as a worldwide crisis and one of the most serious and potentially devastating events this nation has ever encountered. And it points to the healthcare industry as worst prepared. The Washington Post says the full report will be released later this week. Nightbeat's Anthony Moore reports that even before the year 2000 rolls around, panic itself could cause problems.
Despite widespread fears and a bit of panic about the Y2K bug infecting banking and government systems and making them inoperable, just because programmers forgot to use enough spaces for the date on the computers, nothing really happened. But techies swore it wasn't a hoax. In the background, more than $300 billion was spent worldwide to implement compliance in the Y2K lead-up. Banks led the way in updating their systems from ATMs to vaults. clocks and locks, the Federal Reserve greased the skids with an extra $200 billion at member banks for weary customers making those last-minute just-in-case cash withdrawals. The US, Europe, United Nations, and other governments passed legislation to prep crisis management. The UK even had armed forces ready for emergency response in the event of failures.
Real risks of panic behavior, which could have a profound impact on our society.
Why? Because Y2K is the first end-of-the-world prophecy in history where something will definitely happen on the predicted date. And you don't have to have religion to believe.
Whoa. On January 10th, 2000, AOL, America Online, announced a merger with Time Warner, the largest yet to be dialed up. In February 2000, Fed Chair Alan Greenspan announced his intention to raise interest rates sharply, with a bubble building up around internet and tech stocks since the late 90s. The flood of new users and the Y2K prepping fueled tech purchases and a resulting speculation bubble on the stock market. Predictably, Greenspan's interest hike prompted market volatility as tech firms faced higher borrowing costs. News in March 2000 of a Japanese recession impacted technology companies as stocks were sold off. On the date of the spring equinox, March 20, 2000, an article in Barron's heralded the dot-com bubble burst. Beginning, when will the internet bubble burst? For scores of net upstarts, that unpleasant popping sound is likely to be heard before the end of this year. Apparently, the article itself made investors shaky about their investments, without questioning who was leading whom. The following day, on March 21, 2000, the Fed raised rates by a quarter point, enough to signal slower growth to keep inflation in check by putting the federal funds rate at its highest point in 5 years. Initially, markets climbed on the news, with one investor telling CNN Money the theory is that with rate increases, it doesn't affect the new economy stocks. But the rate hike led to an inverted yield curve, where long-term yields fall below short-term ones, historically a sign that investors anticipate recessions and will settle for lower-risk long-term investments. On June 7, 2000, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ordered the breakup of Microsoft in an antitrust lawsuit wherein the company's dominance was found to constitute a monopoly, one working to thwart competition. The decision triggered a 15% decline in Microsoft stocks and took the entire NASDAQ tech-related stocks down 350 points on a real downer note. However, Microsoft later appealed and received a judgment in their favor in June 2001. As of September 6, 2001, the Department of Justice announced it would no longer pursue their breakup, but merely antitrust fines. So a slap on the wrist. But that's not what most people remember from that time period.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
The 9/11 attacks in 2001 affected nearly a week of market closures, only reopening with great caution on Monday, September 17th. Even then, leading to a record 7.1% single-day plunge on the Dow Jones, an equally historic 14.3% decline that week, with $1.4 trillion wiped out. 500,000 jobs immediately gone in New York City, $2.8 billion in decimated wages, $27 billion gone at city level, and most importantly, 3,000 lives lost, with severe health issues for tens of thousands of rescue workers. The event consequences a thick, goopy coating of government aid and intervention at all levels: economic, political, media, psychological, total. The collapse of Building 7, the third building to fall on 9/11, took no further recorded lives, but had its own almost imperceptible, yet uniquely ripe consequences. Besides housing many clients from the upper crust of finance, including Salomon Brothers, Smith Barney, American Express International, Provident Financial, ITT Hartford Insurance, First Statement Management Group, and Federal Home Loan Bank. The World Trade Center 7 skyscraper also housed some of the most important regulatory agencies in the financial world. "47 stories of destruction included an untold number of financial disclosure and audit documents, almost exactly as the end of the 1999 film Fight Club depicted.
Out these windows, we will view the collapse of financial history, one step closer to economic equilibrium.
Whatever wasn't backed up was wiped into oblivion. Decades of crucial data was destroyed in a masterstroke of criminal conspiracy.
And your new Building 7.
Loans, credit cards, put options, guarantees, and most assuredly some alluring details on the newly deregulated financial products market. Specifically, this affected the Securities Exchange Commission, whose Special Manhattan Investigations Division was housed there on 3 floors. Insider trading probes, kickbacks, market manipulations, overhyping of IPO prices, and other dirty laundry just hanging out over Wall Street and the tech bubble. This was no trivial matter.
And that means we must recognize another transformation: the revolution in management, technology, and business practices. Successful modern businesses are leaner and less hierarchical than ever before. They reward innovation and they share information. They have to be nimble in the face of rapid change or they die. Business enterprises die if they fail to adapt. And the fact that they can fail and die is what provides the incentive to survive. But governments can't die. So we need to find other incentives for bureaucracy to adapt and improve. The technology revolution has transformed organizations across the private sector. But not ours, not fully, not yet. We are, as they say, tangled in our anchor chain. Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. We cannot share information from floor to floor in this building because it's stored on dozens of different technological systems that are inaccessible or incompatible.
October 1st, 2001, papers disclosed that files, depositions, trading records, and other documents for several hundred cases, perhaps several thousand, were destroyed on 9/11. Major investigations were delayed. In consequence, and with great irony, the SEC, a strapped agency with no fat in its budget, reportedly faced hard choices about which cases to pursue. One undermined case, which was specifically apparently involving alleged kickbacks to underwriters who backed allegedly overpriced initial public offerings, fleecing naive investors under the guise of several notable high-tech ventures. Big names were mentioned. Many older cases were also discarded. Meanwhile, the SEC was also tasked, at least nominally, to investigate insider trading in the weeks leading up to 9/11. You know, on their destroyed records, no fat budget, checking out put options on airlines and other markets vulnerable to the optics of the largest scale media-saturated terrorism event in known modern human history. Fingers were never pointed in any major way, but let's never forget either what kind of data could have been permanently deleted.
It is now my honor to sign into law the USA Patriot Act of 2001.
At any rate, the public's appetite for corruption news shifted to the Enron scandal,
The House Financial Services Committee will begin the first congressional hearings on the Enron debacle tomorrow morning, but they'll be doing it without much help from Enron. Late today, the company announced that neither CEO Ken Lay or any other company representative will be here to answer questions. Employee retirement funds were wiped out, while at the same time, top executives were personally making millions.
You're the only financial institution that can't produce a balance sheet or a cash flow statement with their earnings.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Your husband earned about $300 million in compensation and stocks from Enron over the last 4 years. What happened to all that money?
It's gone. It's gone. There's nothing left.
Committee members will be focusing on what they described as the company's overstated earnings, mishandling of the 401k plan, possible securities fraud, and accounting irregularities.
I urged Mr. Lay to find out who lost that money. If he discovered that this loss would be borne by Enron shareholders via an issuance of stock in the future, then I thought we had a very large problem on our hands.
This is the shredded evidence we got that came out of Enron.
Making headlines throughout October 2001 over systematic accounting fraud ongoing since the savings and loan era.
Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity. We play by all of the rules. We stand by our word. We mean what we say what we mean. We want people to leave a transaction with Enron thinking that they've been dealt with in the highest possible way as far as integrity and truthfulness.
Shareholders filed a $40 billion lawsuit after stocks plummeted to $1 a share in November. Documents were shredded, more financial data was destroyed, and with Enron's credit on the chopping block, Rubin, in his new role as Citigroup's chairman of the executive committee, a bank that held $3 billion of Enron's debt, mind you, called a leading Treasury official for help in diffusing or delaying the credit downgrade.
Enron had been the largest corporate contributor to the first presidential campaign of George W. Bush.
Now, what did Enron get in return for their campaign contributions from the federal government? Amazingly enough, as far as I understand, Mr. Chairman, they are still in line today for a $254 million tax rebate if the Republican House version of the economic stimulus bill becomes law. Thank you, Enron, for all the good work that you are doing, and you're going to get a check of $254 million from the American people. Clearly, that's an outrage.
You know, Enron had made contributions to a lot of people around Washington, D.C. And if they came to this administration looking for help, they didn't find any.
There is no question but Enron, through their political contributions and influence, has had an enormous impact on energy policy and the way this government does business. That's wrong. It's got to be changed.
Overall, Enron became the iconic scandal of its day. You know, at least until the next one. Years later, just after being convicted in 2006, Enron's CEO Ken Lay either died suddenly or got an unlisted address in a deep underground military base. Go ahead and figure them odds. Long-distance giant WorldCom had its own accounting fraud scandal in the summer of 2002, resulting from billions in overstated value. Their stock status was, in turn, demoted to junk. Investors lost out again. Typical, I guess, but these sorts of accounting scandals generally contributed to a downturn in the markets. The tech bubble had basically burst. Over $5 trillion evaporated since the height of dot-com investments. A minor recession washed over, something like the end of Phase 1 for the internet-based economy. Financially speaking, markets saw the rather despicable and deceitful Iraq War as a comeback opportunity. On March 18, 2003, while the SEC was still charging bankers tied in the Enron scandal, commentators were cheering on a quick victory in Iraq, promising benefits that would include an economic boost, fixing world order. This is all while the Dow Jones stock market was triumphantly surging in the march to war. But some also cautioned against the premature attitude, with Merrill Lynch's chief economist noting, even if the war with Iraq is quick and successful, the economy still faces considerable headwinds. The post-bubble workout period will likely prove longer than consensus expects. In that context of trying to please markets, investors, and Daddy himself by repeating with Bush Jr.'s war the economic booster shot of the 1992 Gulf War, which also overlaid a recession, we can better comprehend the otherwise incomprehensible arrogance of George W.'s ridiculously premature declaration of mission accomplished on May Day, 2003.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Unaware or perhaps just uncaring of how out of touch he would appear, how many lives it would cost, and how much damage would ultimately be done. Unaccountable trillions were spent in Iraq on conflict, contractors, and reconstruction, and in the quieter but more complex and prolonged Afghan theater. Such a point of absurdity was reached that U.S. forces were shipping in literal, and I mean seriously literal, pallets of cash. $4 billion in cold, hard cash. A critical congressman quipped, "Who in their right mind would send 363 tons of cash into a war zone?"
In a 13-month period from May 2003 to June 2004, the Federal Reserve sent nearly $12 billion in cash, mainly in $100 bills from the United States to Iraq. To do that, the Federal Reserve Bank in New York had to pack 281 million individual bills, including more than 107 $100 bills, onto wooden pallets to be shipped to Iraq. The cash weighed more than 363 tons and was loaded onto C-130 cargo planes to be flown into Baghdad. The numbers are so large that it doesn't seem possible that they're true. Who in their right mind would send 360 tons of cash into a war zone? But that's exactly what our government did.
The pallets of cash were, of course, a drop in the bucket. But it's not like anybody was keeping score when terrorism exists.
Ladies and gentlemen, we all understand that these filmmakers have no intention of wrapping things up. And that's why I'm here, to stall you just a little bit longer. Now go take a pee, come right back. The other day, Melissa raised a good point. She asked, who owns the Federal Reserve? To find out, we went straight to the source, knowing that sources are a great place to find straightforward answers to important questions. Here we are on the federalreserve.gov. Who owns the Federal Reserve? Right here, the Federal Reserve System fulfills its public mission as an independent entity within government. It is not owned by anyone and not a private profit-making institution. However, it's considered an independent central bank because its monetary policy decisions do not have to be approved by the president or anyone else. Not owned by anyone? Do explain, we demanded of the source. There is some oversight, but the Federal Reserve can be more accurately described as independent within government rather than independent of government. Independent within government rather than independent of government? That's confusing. I agree, said Mel.
First of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency. There is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
What the relationships are don't frankly matter.
The 12 Federal Reserve banks, according to federalreserve.gov, are organized similarly to private corporations, possibly leading to some confusion about ownership. These member banks get stock in the company and are guaranteed by law 6% per year dividends. Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee back in the 1930s, put it a little bit differently. Quote, some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are private monopolies which prey upon the people of these United States for the benefit of themselves, foreign and domestic speculators, and rich and predatory moneylenders. Unchecked power, just like no founding father wanted ever. You know, Thinking about who owns the Federal Reserve but doesn't own it makes me kind of pissed off. That's when Melissa nodded and said, yes, but it's better to be pissed off than pissed on. With the question of who owns the Fed so murky, perhaps the better question is, who owns you?
Technically, all money is fiat because the value is assigned arbitrarily.
In the background of the media obsession with the war on terror, the dollar was falling from glory. In January 2004, Davos conferenced the decline of the Federal Reserve note.
And behind all this, of course, is real worries about currencies again. You've been reading the papers, the weak dollar and what it means for the rest of the world.
I think it's in the best interest of China sort of to set up a new system where the yuan is not pegged solely to the dollar.
What we are seeing at the moment is probably, I would guess, the biggest foreign currency intervention operations in history. And as a result, we are effectively looking at a two-currency zone world, one of which is the extended dollar zone, which includes, of course, China and to a considerable extent Japan. And the way that unravels is, I think, going to be one of the big, and it is going to unravel. I'm quite clear about that.
And the new stardom of the yuan renminbi, with China as a rising global superpower, one that would eventually rival the hegemony of the almighty buck. Panelists, including Chinese economists, heralded a Chinese world reserve currency, perhaps 50 years from now, sometime after 2050. On the flip side, this falling dollar was forecast to increase demand for U.S. exports. Fed officials anticipated demand for a cheaper dollar against a stuck-up snooty euro and other appreciating currencies. And that was considered good news, as it was reported the Bush administration was pumping so much money into U.S. corporations through its war spending and other fiscal measures that their profits will keep soaring, and Wall Street will keep rising despite budget deficits, coupled with a sharply declining currency. On September 17, 2004, the FBI warned of epidemic fraud in mortgage and other financial markets, following a five-fold increase in fraud investigations as compared with 2001, initiating the largest effort in FBI history to undermine fraudulent activities in the financial sector. At risk, in short, was the next savings and loan crisis. While honing in on half a dozen hotspot cities under Operation Continued Action, the FBI cautioned that the mortgage industry as a whole faced potential multi-billion-dollar losses amid the booming mortgage market and corresponding attempts by bad actors to exploit its vulnerabilities. But let's face it, little to nothing ever came of these investigations, certainly not in the bigger picture. The individuals and groups busted here were small-timers. The real big-time guys up at the top there would prove to have something of an institutional immunity. 17 years earlier, in June 1987, the FBI likewise warned of epidemic levels of fraud and embezzlement in the banking industry, with more than $1.1 billion in losses in 1986 and close to $1 billion during 1985. Insider embezzlement was a factor in at least a third of these cases, according to Federal Reserve officials. So funny how history repeats, the repeating bitch that it is.
After all, there may be some politics in all this.
But while blind faith in the dollar carried the country through a politically divisive and bitter period, by 2007 it all stood on the brink of disaster. One that the system seemed poised, excuse the necessary pun, to capitalize upon.
Sponge your money never done. Sponge your money, ha ha. Sponge your money gonna never done. Now sponge your money. Oh, sponge your money gonna never done. Sponge your. Grate your potato. I grate your potato. Put a little piece of pumpkin in it, gonna make it yellow. Love, girl, love. Love, girl, love. Love, girl, love, girl. Sponge your money. Ah! Sponge gonna never done. Sponge. Oh, mama, gonna sponge your money, gonna never done. I know you like it. Oh, money gonna never done. Sponge your money. I went down to town the other day, sponge your money. I see all them boys getting bouncy, now sponge your money. What I call my money, get $5 go on the trip, now sponge your money. Oh, mama gonna, mama gonna sponge your money. Love, God, love, love, God, love, love, God, love, God, sponge. Oh, sponge your money gonna never done. Oh, you're going to Nara. You're going to Nara. Oh, you put 1/2 yard in it, gonna make it wider. Oh, sponge your money, gonna never done. Sponge the money. Oh, mama, go sponge your money, go. La nini, la 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 da 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 do da do do da do da la do deep la do la do it la do la la do la do. Oh mama, oh sponge your money, sponge your money, sponge your money never. Sponge your money, now sponge your money never done. Love, God, love, love, God, love. Oh, love, God, sponge your. I sponge your money, gonna never done. Oh, sponge your money, gonna never done. Oh, sponge your money, gonna never done. Oh, grate your potato, grate your potato. Put a little piece of pumpkin in it, gonna make it yellow. Oh, sponge your money gonna never done. Hey, la 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 la. I'm going, Lord, 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 Lord. La da 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 da. Sponge your money never done. Sponge your money.